Good morning, guys. We're going to finish up with your Settling the West information today. This is kind of the way it would be if we were in class. You would probably have 2 days of it. Like the first day, we would do that first part of the lecture notes, and then the second part, the next day in class. So it kind of divides up pretty evenly. So we're going to finish up. Yesterday, we talked about why people were moving westward. So you have the gold strikes that happened, like the Klondike, the gold rush in California, that drew people westward. We're going to see the railroads moving westward, the U.S. government supporting the railroad industry moving westward. We have individuals that are moving westward, our settlers, our pioneers. They are moving westward mainly because they're looking for some economic opportunity. Many of them are looking to be able to own land for the first time. Some of them are fleeing the destruction of the Civil War. Remember, the economy was destroyed in the South by the Civil War, so they're fleeing that. You have freed slaves. Remember, the 13th Amendment has abolished slavery in the United States, so slaves are now free. And many of them are moving westward to be able to own land and to be able to start really building their lives as free American citizens for the first time. We have immigration coming into the Great Plains. A lot of people, especially from Germany and some areas like that are coming in, that are beginning to, again, for land, to be able to develop land and farm or ranch. And then on the west coast, we have California with its gold rush. We also have immigrants coming in from China, specifically, that are coming in from China that are settling in the west coast in California. And they'll be a big part when we talk about the development of railroads. The Chinese immigrants are going to be a big part in the building or laying down the track of those railroads as we begin to try to connect our country east and west with what we call the Transcontinental Railroad. But we finished up yesterday talking about the fact that these settlers were enticed also to the West or the Great Plains by the U.S. government offering what they called Homestead Acts. The Homestead Act is a piece of legislation that basically said, we will allow you to own land cheaply. Well, you can choose up to 160 acres of land that belongs to the government. You live there for 5 years, and then once you've established yourself there and you're still productive at the 5-year mark, then we will hand over the deed to that land. That will become your land. You will be the actual owner of it. So that was enticing people to the West as well. So cheap land, the Homestead Act, the railroads moving westward, the gold, the prospecting that was happening, all of these things are moving people westward as they try to start or create, I guess you could say, to create a life of their own in this new part of the country. And it's all supported by the U.S. government because the U.S. government understands during this time period that if you have territory and it is not claimed, in other words, you don't have settlement in that territory, then other countries of the world will try to colonize that territory. So if we didn't have the Western settlement, if we didn't have people moving west past the Mississippi River, that land would eventually been conquered by some other nation, whether it would be Great Britain, France, Spain, some other nation would come in and conquer that land and take it for their own. So we understood that settling that territory was absolutely necessary if we were going to continue to claim that that land belonged to the United States. So in order to make sure others didn't come in, we have to claim it. Now, as we move westward, however, there are other groups of people that are living in the Great Plains. We call them the Native Americans. Now, remember, the Native Americans came into the New World or into this Western Hemisphere during the Ice Age over the land bridge, right? So remember, our continents were closer together. They came in over the land bridge following food sources. So they're looking for food. They are what we call nomadic, which means that they move from place to place. So as they moved into the Western Hemisphere, the peoples that had followed their food source here began to spread out over the continent of what we call the United States today. They also went southward. So you have natives that are in Canada, the United States, and then southward into Middle America and what we call Latin America. So the native peoples, what we call the native peoples, because they were here when the European settlement started. So when the European exploration started, this is the group of people, these are the groups of people that they came in contact with, right? So your Native Americans is what we call them. Many times you also see in history, they're still called Indians. That is because historically that's what they were called. You're not going to see the term Native Americans until the 1950s and 1960s when they join with the civil rights movement for Native Americans. And so the term Native Americans is not historically used until really around the 60s and the 1950s or 60s, okay? So when we talk about Native Americans, remember that term really kind of lumps all kinds of different tribes into one term. So you have all these different tribes that live across the continent. Many of them do different things for survival. They have different cultures. In the Great Plains, we're talking about the Sioux. You're looking at the Comanche, the Cherokee. Some of those are just a couple of the names of the different tribes that live throughout the Great Plains. So these are the groups that our settlers are coming in contact with. Now, in the Great Plains, most of the Native American groups were what we call nomadic, which means that they roamed from place to place following their food source. So their food source and the most important part of their culture was the buffalo, because their culture literally depended upon the buffalo. So they would follow the herds. So when the herds would migrate to different areas throughout the Great Plains, these tribes would pick up and they would move to follow those herds, right? And so that's the development of their culture. Now, as the new settlers are coming in, they are building homes. They're using barbed wire to fence off regions or acres. And because of that, every time a settler comes in and creates a homestead, it interrupts the migration pattern of the buffalo. Now, if the migration pattern of the buffalo is interrupted, it in turn interrupts the Native American culture, right? So, because they're connected. So the new settlers are taking over this land that would be considered hunting ground for the Native Americans because they're establishing homesteads. In other words, guys, they're not moving. The settlers are coming in and staying in one place. So you build a home, you fence off your acreage, you begin plowing up the land, or you bring in your herds for grazing, whatever it is that you're doing in the development of that land. Now, because I do that, that changes where the buffalo can go. So the buffalo's migration patterns change. When the migration patterns for the buffalo changes, that changes the migration patterns for these nomadic tribes. Okay, now remember, not all Native American tribes are nomadic, but the ones in the Great Plains, the majority of those tribes are. All right, so we're going to kind of focus on those as we talk about what we call the Indian Wars in the Great Plains. Right, so the natives are deprived of their hunting grounds. And so because of that, they're forced to relocate to new territories. It also means that you have two cultures that are now coming in contact with one another. Right, now, that means that you have two different perspectives of the land. You have one perspective where the tribes want to be able to continue to roam across the land freely. You have another perspective that says, no, I have to be able to settle here. And once I settle here, you can't just roam across my property, right? So you're going to see this clash in ideas about the land itself. And so it basically, it's like we talked about when you talked about your world history, where you have in world history, they talk about how one culture comes in contact with another culture. There's a clash that happens, and one empire or one civilization will rise over the other. So one will be defeated, and one will be the victor. Okay, and that's what's going to happen on the Great Plains. Is you're going to have two. You have with the Native Americans, you have multiple tribes, which means that you have multiple cultures. And like we said, we're kind of lumping them all together, which is not necessarily the best way to do it, but it makes it easier to identify what's happening on the Great Plains, right? So what we're going to do is these tribes, like we said, there's multiple tribes. The Sioux is probably one of the largest tribes. That's the tribe that you'll hear the most about. The Comanche, the Cherokee, the Blackfoot, some of those are still important, but you won't hear them named as much in this. All right, now you can do a lot of research and you can find a lot of information about the different tribes. All right, but for our purposes, we're kind of historically we're just going to kind of lump them together. All right, so our Native Americans and have now come in contact with our settlers. There's going to be a clash of cultures here. You're going to see that the Native Americans believed that as you saw this influx of settlers coming in, they thought, okay, here's what we're going to do is we're going to attack these settlers and their way of transportation into this area, into the Great Plains, and then they will stop coming, right? So their idea was to attack and kill, and then other people would hear that happened and they wouldn't follow, right? So that was kind of what they started doing. So many of the Native Americans would attack wagon trains. Remember, you had wagon trains that were moving westward. I'm sure you've done like the Oregon Trail. If you haven't, the Oregon Trail game is really fun. It's a little. Some of you probably did it in your Texas history classes in the 7th grade. But the Oregon Trail, you can still get it. It's an older game. It's been around forever, but there's different versions of it that you can get through your app store if you're interested in that. And it's just a real simple idea of what it looks like moving westward, right? Some of the pitfalls that people, and some of the things that they had to face as they moved westward. And of course, one of them is Native American attacks, right? So they would group together for safety. So instead of just one family in a covered wagon heading westward, they would get multiple families or multiple people all together in one group, and they would call it a wagon train. And they would all travel together westward, all right? And so the Native Americans would attack these wagon trains, and they would kill anybody that they were capable of killing. So this meant that the Native Americans were attacking wagon trains that had men, but they also had women and children in them. And so some of those stories are the stories that are going to get back to the East about how Native Americans are killing women and children. And so you're going to see a reaction to that from those that are still in the eastern portion of the United States, right? So Native Americans are going to attack wagon trains, stagecoaches. They're going to attack homestead and ranches. They're going to attack the railroads. So as you had railroad workers that were out, that were laying track, they would attack those workers to try to stop what they called the iron horse, which was their name for the trains. They called them iron horses. And so they wanted to try to stop the iron horse that was bringing all of these people westward as well. They would tear down communication lines. Remember, they did Morse code. And so they had these telegraph lines that would connect towns. And so Native Americans would try to tear those down so that towns couldn't communicate with one another. So there was all these different ways that they were sabotaging the settlement or the movement westward. And their idea truly was, if we can kill enough of them, they will stop coming. That's not exactly what happened. Well, it's not what happened at all. They killed them. They killed all kinds of our settlers. They attacked different settlers. All these stories get back to the East. It's in the newspapers. Everybody's hearing about the Native American attacks. And the opposite happens. So instead of people saying, oh, we're too afraid to go to the West, now what happens is we're going to go out West and we are going to make sure that the Native Americans can't do this anymore. And so now the US government can say, okay, we're going to send our military out West. Because remember, the Civil War's over. So we can send our military out West and we can protect our settlers from these Native American attacks. Now, what you have is a war, because now you have two military forces that are going to have to face off against one another. Okay? And so in 1867, one of the things that happened is there was a creation of what's called the Indian Peace Commission. And the Indian Peace Commission proposed two large reservations on the plains. You would have one for the Sioux. Remember, that's a very, very large tribe of the Great Plains, the Sioux Indians. And then you had one for the other Southern Plains Indians, right? So your other tribes were not as large as the Sioux. And so you had a tribe that kind of combined them onto a reservation. Okay. Now, the reservation, the idea originally, which you'll see is going to completely differ from what actually happens. But the original idea was to have a large enough reservation that the Native Americans could still track their buffalo. So in other words, they could still roam across this reservation, following their buffalo, and still be able to be nomadic and their culture intact. But the problem with it is obviously the reservations aren't going to be large enough for that to be maintained. Your buffalo, they don't know that they're supposed to stay in a certain area. They're moving according to where the settlement is, because they're trying to get away from the settlement. So there's a couple of major problems that happens, obviously, with the intent of the reservation. And then in practice, the reservations are completely terrible. The conditions are harsh. The Native Americans that went onto these, remember, they voluntarily go onto these reservations because they felt like they had an opportunity to maintain their culture. In other words, guys, they were trying to create a situation where both cultures could continue to grow and develop. The problem is that it's not something that in reality was ever really going to be able to happen. Because of the differences in the culture and the fact that both cultures are trying to use the same tracts of land, right? So the reservations are created. Some of the Native American tribes are going to go onto those reservations as part of this treaty and this commission that's been established. The problem is that once they get onto these reservations, the buffalo herds aren't where they need them to be. The management of the reservations is poor. The U.S. government does an awful job of making sure that they follow through with giving them the food and the necessities for the reservation to be successful. So these are Native Americans that are going to live in poverty. They end up being depressed and living in despair. There's corruption throughout. They have what's called Indian agents of the government. They're corrupt. A lot of them take the money from the government and don't buy the things that are supposed to be bought for the reservations. And so this plan that they had is absolutely doomed because of the corruption and the fact that these two cultures are going to clash with one another. Right? So the reservation, the Peace Commission is set up, but the reservation idea is not successful. All right. So the Native Americans begin to leave the reservations to follow their buffalo herds. And what they're going to find is that by the 1870s, as they leave the reservations in disgust, their people can't live there. All right. They're living in poverty. People are starving to death. You cannot live there. It is and just an incredibly awful place to be. So many of the Native Americans are going to leave those reservations. Now, when they leave the reservations, it technically breaks the treaties that have been signed. All right. So that's one of the issues that we have. The American government breaks all kinds of treaties. Right. And so, but this is when they leave them, the reservations, the treaties are broke. Because remember, they had gone onto the reservations voluntarily because they had this idea of having this peace commission, but it doesn't work. So when they leave the reservations, because they're disgusted with the way they're having to live, so they leave the reservations. Now what they find as they go out and search for their herds of buffalo is the buffalo are almost completely gone. So we literally had hundreds of thousands. We basically had over 1 million buffalo that roamed the Great Plains at one point. By the time our Native Americans leave their reservations, the buffalo herds are almost completely gone. The buffalo herds had been killed by those that were moving across the plains, right? So they wanted to get rid of them. You have professional buffalo hunters that go into the Great Plains. Now, your professional buffalo hunters are only looking for one thing, right? They're looking for the hides. What they're going to do is kill hundreds and hundreds of buffalo, take their hides, and leave the buffalo carcasses laying on the Great Plains, because they are not using the meat, they're not using the bone, they're not using any of that. They just want the hides. The hides were extremely popular in fashion for the East and for some of your European countries. And so you could make a pretty good profit selling these hides, and people would make coats out of the hides, they would make hats, blankets, those types of things. And so these professional hunters would come in and basically decimate these herds, kill everything that they could kill as fast as they could kill it, and just leave the meat rotting in the sun and take the hides. And so that was something that was decimating the herds. You started fewer and fewer buffalo, wild buffalo on the Great Plains. And then you had those that killed for sport. Your railroads were also part of that. The railroads were twofold. You had the railroads were killing buffalo to keep them away from their track, because their trains, if their trains ran into the buffalo or multiple buffalo that were bison that were standing on the track, it would damage the train or damage the track. So they would kill them to keep them away from the track. You had those that were killing for sport. So as the trains would roll down the track, these buffalo herds, like pretend like you're on a plane, or on a train, and you are looking out the window. And when you look out the window, what you see on your screen here, that little picture there, you see that outside your window. So a lot of those that killed for sport, they would just pull the window or open the window up and begin shooting. And they would shoot and kill these buffalo as the train rolled by. They didn't take anything. They didn't use the hide. They didn't use the horns. They didn't use the bone. They didn't take the meat. They just left them out there to die. And so you have your railroad sharpshooters killing to keep them away. You have those that are killing them for sport. You have the buffalo hunters that are seeking just their hide. And you also have the U.S. government. The U.S. government wants to get rid of the buffalo because they understand that the buffalo is tied to the Native American culture. And so if the Native Americans don't have the buffalo to hunt, then they're not roaming the Great Plains. They can no longer be nomadic because their food source is gone. All right, so they basically decimated the American buffalo and brought it to the point of extinction. Now, the American buffalo is the only place in the whole world that you can find this type of animal is in the United States. The American buffalo does not exist anywhere else in the world. So if it goes extinct, there's nowhere else to find them. And so by the time the 1880s rolled around, the buffaloes basically facing extinction. There are very few of them left on the Great Plains. And what's going to save the buffalo is actually going to be the Wild West shows that start as the frontier comes to an end, right? And those Wild West shows they would use the buffalo as part of their shows. They would run them in, and they would show how the Native Americans would hunt the buffalo. And so the shows would have herds of buffalo that they developed on a ranch somewhere. And those herds of buffalo would be used or they would use some of them from those herds in their shows. And so that's literally what saved our buffalo. Had it not been for that, the buffalo would have gone extinct and we wouldn't have this magnificent animal anymore. Now, today they're protected. And so you see them a lot in South Dakota. We have a lot of them in our national parks where they're allowed to roam freely. So we have saved it. It's not anywhere near where they were prior to westward expansion. They literally had millions of head of buffalo. And in certain areas, then when their herds would roam by, you could see them as far as you could see. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. If you've never watched the show Dances with Wolves, I'm sorry, it's an old show, but it's a beautifully made show. It has these beautiful photographic scenes where they show the buffalo. It's a soldier, an American soldier that's on the Great Plains that comes in contact with a Native American tribe there. But the scenes that are in that show that he comes in contact with some of the buffalo herds, how immense those herds are, is similar to what you would have seen during the 1860s, 1850s. And you would have been able to see, literally, there's a scene where you can't not see buffalo, where he's sitting and you look out, it's just buffalo as far as you can see all the way to the horizon. That's how large that herd is. So if you get a chance that you can watch maybe some scenes from that would be, I think that would give you an idea of what we're talking about. But it's called Dances with Wolves. I'll see if I can find a clip for you guys and put it on your module, just so you can see what it looks like, okay? But the buffalo was basically decimated. Now, once we kill off the buffalo to the point that Native Americans can't follow that, there's not enough of them to support the Native American cultures, okay? So these nomadic cultures don't have a food source to follow anymore with the destruction of the buffalo, right? So that puts the Native Americans in a really bad position because now you don't have your food source. What are you supposed to do? So what's going to happen is we're going to see what we call our Indian Wars that are going to take place in the Great Plains. So the Native Americans are fighting for their way of life as the settlers are moving in, establishing their way of life, right? One of the battles of Indian Wars that we need you guys to know about, it's called the Battle of Little Bighorn. It's also known as Custer's Last Stand. So Custer's Last Stand and Battle of Little Bighorn is the same battle, okay? It takes place in 1876. And what's going to happen is the Lakota tribe, which is part of the Sioux tribe, the Lakota they have a reservation in South Dakota. And part of South Dakota is you have these beautiful mountains in South Dakota. And that's where Mount Rushmore is, okay, to kind of give you an idea. But the Lakota reservation is located in South Dakota. Well, gold is discovered in those mountains in what we call the Black Hills. Well, that gold, obviously, like we talked about earlier, gold and the promise of being able to make it rich fast brings all these prospectors and fortune hunters into South Dakota, which means that you're going to have a lot of people that are on the Lakota reservation in South Dakota looking for gold in the Black Hills. So because of this, many of the Lakota left the reservation. All right. Now remember, when the tribe leaves the reservation, now it's where it gets sticky, because when they leave the reservation, they break the treaty. But they broke the treaty because the fortune hunters and the prospectors moved onto their reservation, if that makes sense. And so the treaty is broken, I guess you could say, by both sides, but I think your settlers coming in are the ones that break it first because they're the ones that were looking for gold. And because of their presence, the Lakota left. Right now, the Black Hills is supposed to be an area that has significance spiritually for the Lakota. They look to the Black Hills as part of their religion. And so they believe that the Great Spirit is a part of the Black Hills, and it's part of how they worship, right? So even though they left the reservation, they still believe that this portion of South Dakota had great spiritual significance to them. Now, because the Lakota left the reservation, you have some of the young men that are part of their tribes, these are their warriors, that leave the reservation and begin attacks on those that are moving into that area, your settlers and your prospectors and those types of folks, all right? So the government, the US government, responds to the Native American attacks by sending in troops, okay? Now remember, the Native Americans believed if they attacked enough and killed enough people that the settlers would stop. But it has the opposite effect because instead of the settlers stopping, the government responds by sending in the US military. All right, so we're going to send in our military troops. We're going to send in what we call our Buffalo Soldiers. We have 4 different units of Buffalo Soldiers. Your Buffalo Soldiers are your African American units. And they were a big part of the Indian Wars and of the Great Plains and the settling of the Great Plains. They were a huge part of it. So you had 2 cavalry units, which means that they were on horseback, and you had 2 units that were on foot. And so the Native Americans called them Buffalo Soldiers. Now, I've heard 2 different reasons for that. I heard, and they're historical. So you have 2 different groups that believe in the naming of the Buffalo Soldiers that the Native Americans called them Buffalo Soldiers because of their hair. Their hair was similar to the buffalo hide. That's the main one. That's mainly why people believe that they were called Buffalo Soldiers, right? And others is because of the strength was similar to buffalo. So it's just the one with the hair is the one that I've heard most often. So they called them Buffalo Soldiers, and that's kind of the name that stuck with those African American units, right? So the Buffalo Soldiers are a big part of settling the Great Plains. You also have all of these different cavalry units that are going to come in to the Great Plains. Now, one of those cavalry units that's going to come in is going to be led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. George Custer is the commander of the 7th Cavalry, right? And the 7th Cavalry has lots of fame in American military history, right? But he's the commander of the 7th Cavalry, and he's part of this expedition that is sent into South Dakota and that area to settle down the issues that are happening, okay? To stop the Native American attacks against those that are moving into that area. So Custer, George Custer is a unique character. He is a veteran of the military. He is someone who has been involved in wars. He was involved in the Civil War. He is well known within the ranks of the soldiers there in the U.S. military, but he also has a pretty big ego. He wants to be someone that history remembers. Unfortunately for him, he's going to be remembered, but not for what he wants to be remembered for. He wants to be remembered as one of the greatest generals in American history. He is going to go down in history as making one of the biggest blunders in American military history. And so what happens is he's part of this expedition that comes in. So he comes in with his cavalry unit, and his job is to hunt and find these Native American groups, okay, because you have these warrior groups that are out in small bands, and then his job is to find them and basically put them back on the reservation or kill. And so Custer is going to come in, and he gets word from one of his scouts, comes back to him and says, "Hey, we found where a large group of Native Americans are settled, right? So they have a an encampment along the river, and so this river is called the Little Bighorn River, and so this encampment has many of the warriors that have left the reservation, and so Custer sees his chance. This is his chance to make it big. So he starts to move towards the river, the Little Bighorn River. Now, he is supposed to stay where he's at and get reinforcements and then go engage with the Native American group that's there, the tribes. There's multiple tribes that are here, okay? So it's not just one tribe. So there's multiple tribes that have come together. Their warriors are together. And this is an encampment where they have set up, and they have some of their women and children in this encampment. And so Custer hears about this encampment. He thinks that he's going to be this great hero by attacking this encampment and killing or taking hostage. I don't know if you say hostage, but taking prisoners from this attack. So he has these ideas in his head that he's going to have big headlines in the Eastern newspapers about how brave he is and his 7th Cavalry, what an amazing leader he is. And he has a reputation. Even the Native Americans during that time period know who George Custer is. George Custer, they know him because he has blonde hair. So he's blonde-headed, blue eyes. His blonde hair had these long curls. So you kind of see in the picture here, the curls that he has on his hair. And he usually wore it right around his shoulders. So it was real obvious of this blonde hair that he had. And so the Native Americans knew who he was, right, before this battle takes place. And so when he launches his attack along the Little Bighorn River, he had made some mistakes. The first mistake he made is he didn't follow orders, and he didn't have his backup. Okay, so there was supposed to be another, I think 2 or 3 cavalry units that were supposed to be there with him, and he took off on his own thinking that he was going to be this big hero. The other mistake he makes is he leaves his cannon behind and some of his weapons because he's trying to travel fast. And so he leaves those behind to be able to travel faster, to be able to get there quicker. And so he gets there and he rushes in, right? So they get there, and basically what you have is you kind of have a hill, and down below is the river. And there you see the encampment. So he rushes down to the encampment. His 7th Cavalry rushes in on the encampment. And what they find is not an encampment full of warriors. What he finds is an encampment that's almost empty. It does have some Native Americans there, but it's basically empty. And when he looks around and he finds that he's absolutely surrounded by warriors of different Native American tribes. And so these different tribes had come together to fight against the American military. And so they attack and they kill all the American soldiers. So the entire 7th Cavalry is murdered or killed by the Native Americans, including George Custer. And so Custer's a victim of this massacre as well. This is a great victory for the Native Americans. Right now, one of the leaders of one of the tribes told his people once they attacked and were victorious, he told them that he had a vision. And in his vision, they were not to take anything, not one single thing, from those that they had killed in this battle. Now, they didn't listen to him. So they took hats, coats, buttons, took horses, you name it. Now, most of the horses of the 7th Cavalry were killed in the battle. But there were a couple that are there. Yeah, there was a couple that the Native Americans took. And when the U.S. military shows up on the scene after the massacre is taking place, so after the 7th Cavalry has been massacred and the Native Americans are no longer there, another cavalry unit shows up. This was supposed to be his backup. These are the people he was supposed to be waiting on. And they see all across this field, in this big, tall grass, all of these dead bodies. The entire 7th Cavalry's dead, including Custer. All their horses are gone, except for one. There's one horse who has been severely injured, but he's still alive. And usually during that time period, if you have a horse that's injured, they would put it down. But because of what had happened there, this unit saves this horse, and it becomes kind of a mascot for the cavalry units in the U.S. military for years to come, right? So there's a whole story that goes with that, but I don't want to run down that path with you guys because I know that we're taking quite a bit of time. Okay, so Custer has now been killed. His 7th Cavalry has been killed. Now, as the military comes in, they see this massacre. They see the death of all of this unit. As the Native Americans celebrate this great, great victory, what they don't realize is that this is actually the beginning of the end of the Native Americans in the Great Plains of the United States. Because of the massacre, because of what they call Custer's Last Stand, all these stories circulate in the East, in the newspapers, of how viciously the American military was attacked and killed by the Native Americans, how they were ambushed and killed. And the word massacre comes up over and over and over again. And so the American military, the U.S. Army, steps up its campaign, which means more soldiers being sent to the Great Plains, more military units being sent in. The U.S. government goes after the Native Americans in full force. So there's no more negotiating. There's no more talking about treaties and reservation life. And you go onto a reservation on your own. That's no longer in the conversation, right? So because of the Battle of Little Bighorn, the campaign steps up. And now the U.S. sends in its entire army into the Great Plains. And their goal is not to talk. Their goal is not to ask Native Americans to get on a reservation. Now the goal is, if you don't get on a reservation, then you will die, right? So they're no longer asking. It's no longer optional. Now reservation life is required. So if you're a Native American, you need to live on a reservation. There's no more roaming free, right? If we catch you, we're going to put you on a reservation. If you don't stay on that reservation, now we're going to hunt you down, right? So this particular battle is a huge changing point in the Great Plains and in the Indian Wars. All right, so this is the beginning of the end for our Native Americans. Okay. Now, what we're going to see is, as the military is chasing these Native American groups, remember there's different ones, like you have the Lakota and the Sioux and the Comanche and Cherokee and all that, you have all these different tribes, but they're chasing them, different ones throughout the Great Plains. Many of them have returned to the reservations. You do have some that will continue to flee from the U.S. military. The U.S. military is chasing them across the U.S. territories. Sitting Bull is one of the most famous. Sitting Bull is actually going to take his followers to Canada. So he literally takes his tribe and he takes them to Canada. Other Lakota are going to be forced to return to the reservations. They're going to have to give up the Black Hills, because now the Black Hills, remember, now has gold. And so the United States has prospectors and settlements there. And so that reservation is much, much different than when the Lakota were there originally, right? So it's changed because of the breaking of the treaties. Another famous Native American leader is Chief Joseph. He fled in 1877. He took his followers on a 1,300-mile journey, but then eventually had to surrender. His people were starving to death, and he couldn't support them. Remember, there's no buffalo for them, so there's no way to continue to support what needs to happen in their culture. So many of them were starving to death. And so he surrenders with his followers, and he is exiled to the Oklahoma Territory. The Oklahoma Territory is where most of the a big section or portion of reservations are going to end up. You'll see another big, large section over in what we now have as New Mexico. Okay, and so, but Sitting Bull and Chief Joseph are two heroes in the Native American culture, because they literally fought until they could not fight anymore and had to be forced onto the reservations. Okay, and so they're heroes in the Native American culture. One event that we want you to know about in regards to the Indian Wars is what we call Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is important because you still had, before Wounded Knee takes place, you still have some uprisings in different sections of different parts of the Great Plains. And we still have some small warrior groups or bands of warriors that are running from the U.S. military, that are being chased down, that type of thing. And so there's still some skirmishes that are happening and things like that. But for the most part, the war itself is over, and the Native Americans have now been placed on the reservations. But when Wounded Knee happens, it's kind of the final nail in the coffin. This is it. There's nothing. You're not going to have any more true skirmishes and uprisings taking place much longer after Wounded Knee. All right. So this is kind of the finality of the Indian Wars. So what happens is you have the Lakota Sioux on their reservation in 1890, and they're performing a ritual on their reservation. Now, the Indian agents that are in charge of the reservation, they're the government agents. They don't want them performing this ritual. This ritual is called the ghost dance, and they want them to stop doing the ghost dance because they see the ghost dance as a ritual of resistance. And so Sitting Bull, who is one of the leaders that many different Native American groups actually look to for leadership, the Indian agents blame Sitting Bull for allowing the continuation of the ghost dance, for allowing this ritual to take place over and over again. Now, the idea of the ghost dance, this ritual, basically, the idea is they're going to have this ghost dance that takes place where they are going to bring forward all of their ancestors, all the ancestors of their different tribes, and their ancestors will rise up, and they will rise up against the settlers and the Americans, and they will help the Lakota and the other tribes fight and win against the settlers that have come into the territory, right? And so they believe by doing this ghost dance that their ancestors would rise, that the Great Spirit would be a part of them, and that they would be bulletproof, and that no matter how many times the settlers or the Americans shot at them, they would be bulletproof. They wouldn't be able to die because they would have this protection of their ancestors and the Great Spirit. And so they would continuously do this ritual or this ghost dance. And the Indian agents said, you have to stop. Do not do it anymore. Well, Sitting Bull, he's someone who's telling his people about the ghost dance. And remember, Sitting Bull's been forced back onto the reservation. So they still look to him as this leader and this supporter. But the Indian agents see the ghost dance as a resistance, another form of resisting the reservation life. So at Wounded Knee, what we're going to see is there's some supporters that are there that are doing the ghost dance. Okay, so there's a ghost dance that happens. They've been told that they're not allowed to do it anymore. They do it anyway. You have a group of them that are at Wounded Knee that are performing this ritual, and the Indian agents or the U.S. military comes in, and they believe that this group that's there are resisting and are going to eventually become a band that will attack. Okay, so they meet one another. The U.S. military and this group meet one another of Lakota Sioux, and they kind of have a standoff for a little while where nobody really does anything, but there's the tension is rising, and then nobody knows who did it, but somebody fires their weapon, and then all of the U.S. military fires on this group of Native Americans. Now, they had some weapons, but the Native Americans are basically without weapons. I mean, there's some, but there's nothing that can resist a U.S. military force coming in. And so it's a massacre at Wounded Knee. And so about 25 soldiers died, but you had about 200 Lakota men that were killed in this exchange at Wounded Knee. And this is basically, guys, the end. So once Wounded Knee happens, it kind of breaks the back of the Native Americans in regards to being able to fight against the U.S. military and to fight this settlement of the land. And so their back is broken. It's the kind of the last straw at Wounded Knee. And now what we'll see is the Native Americans will be forced onto reservations. Remember, it's not optional now. And their entire life and their livelihood now changes. Okay, so now this is a new narrative for them. There's no more buffalo for them to hunt. You've basically been defeated in war. Your warriors have been defeated, and now you've been forced onto these reservations. Okay? And so now once we're on the reservations, now what we're going to see is what we call forced assimilation. Now, to assimilate into a culture is usually a good thing, because if I immigrate to France, I want to assimilate or absorb the French culture. So I want to learn French. I want to be able to read and write in French. I want to know the French history. I want to know the do's and don'ts of French culture, right? So I assimilate, I absorb that culture into my own. And that helps me to be a part of that new culture that I've moved into, that I've immigrated into, right? So all countries want those immigrating into their nation to assimilate, right? Because that absorbs their culture, their ideals, their belief systems is absorbed into this immigrant group that's coming in, right? So most of the time when they talk about assimilation, it's a good thing. With the reservation life, however, when we talk about assimilation, we're talking about forced assimilation. In other words, they didn't choose this. They've been forced on reservations because they lost the war. So because you lost the war, now what we're going to do is we want you to assimilate into the culture that defeated you, right? Now, normally that would happen in your earlier empires. It would be something where if you're defeated, you either assimilate into that culture completely or you leave that area that you lost. All right. So that in your early years, like 1500s, you would just assimilate, or you would have to leave that area. And many times you'd be taken prisoner and you'd be forced into slavery, or you would be forced out of that area anyway. But in this instance, this is completely unique because this group has lost the war, but they're still there. And the group that's won the war has them located in certain areas of their country. And now what they want to do is they want them to assimilate. So what happens is this is what we call a forced assimilation. The Native Americans living on the reservations, they don't necessarily want to be a part of this new culture, but they've been defeated by that culture. And so they don't have a lot of pushback right now. And so in 1877, one of the things that the government's going to do to try to push them towards this assimilation is they're going to pass what's called the Dawes Act. Now, guys, you have to know the Dawes Act. So in your notes, highlight it, circle it, something. You have to know what the Dawes Act is, right? Just like you had to know what the Homestead Act was. You have to know certain things, certain pieces of legislation, all right? So the Dawes Act is passed, and basically what it does is it says, okay, we're going to give each household, the head of each household on the reservations, we're going to give them 160 acres of reservation land, and you're going to farm that land. So you're going to become farmers, okay? Now, you have to look at what this culture is. This is a nomadic culture that's always roamed. They don't farm. Farming is completely alien to them. They live from place to place, and now you're telling them you have to stay put, stay there on your 160 acres and farm the land. They're not farmers. This is totally alien to them. So this is something that they absolutely despise. They don't want to be farmers. They don't want to do this. So many of them, their allotments of land, the 160 acres, it's too small for the groups that they're in. It's not profitable for them. So many of them sold it. So they sold it to white settlers that were coming in or immigrants that were coming in from other countries. And they would sell it because for them, it was useless. It didn't mean anything because they didn't consider themselves farmers, right? And some of the land that they received is not even farmable, right? So there's all these different issues that many of the Native Americans had to face. And so the forced assimilation, what happens is you would have on the reservation, you would have schools. And in the schools, the Native American children were forced to give up their culture and to embrace the American culture, right? So they would have to cut their hair. They would have to speak English. They would learn American history. They would have to dress a certain way. They would have to act a certain way. So they're teaching them the norms of the American culture. Excuse me. And so one of the big things that was extremely traumatic, especially to young men in the Native American culture, was that when they went to these schools, they would force them to cut their hair. Now, their hair had significance in their culture. So the length of their hair meant something. And they had what were called coups. And so if you were in a situation where you were facing off against another warrior, that warrior, if he could get a section of your hair or something like that, it would call a coup. And so he would be able to take that hair and it was a sign that he was a strong warrior because he was able to take somebody else's hair. It's kind of what we have with the scalping and that type of thing. It's similar, but this is not scalping. This is a coup in which they actually take sections of their hair. And so the longer your hair was, then it showed that you had wisdom. It showed that you were a fierce warrior because it wasn't cut by other warriors, if that makes sense. All right. And so, and this isn't all of them, please. This is not all Native Americans. It's just certain cultures and certain tribes of the Great Plains. But it was significant to their culture to have their hair longer. And so when the schools forced them to cut their hair, it was actually very traumatic to many of these young boys that were part of this culture. And so it was something that traumatized them when they would do that to them because of how they raised and thought about their hair. So that was one thing that was kind of traumatic. If you look at the pictures that are here, so if you look at the two pictures at the bottom, you see this gentleman here, he's in his native dress. And then you see this gentleman here that has the suit and the short hair. Guys, this is the same person. So this is what he looks like before the assimilation process, and this is what he looks like after the assimilation process. And so you can see there's a stark difference. But that's what they were trying to do in the schools, was not just teach but or not just teach like writing and arithmetic and that type of thing, but to push them into this assimilation. Give up this culture and accept this culture. And so that's what was happening on the reservations. And so many of your natives were extremely traumatized, depressed about it, discouraged about their future, because many of them don't see that they actually have a future. And so those were some issues that many of them dealt with. And reservation life became something that was extremely harsh and something that was pretty horrible for generations of Native Americans. Many of them are going to live in poverty even to this day on reservations. Okay? Now, in 1924, you do have what's called the American Indian Citizenship Act, and it granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans that were born in the United States, right? So this way once you have citizenship, remember you have the protection of the U.S. Constitution. So all Native Americans will have the same protections that every other American has in the United States. Now, being on reservations, there's some differences. If you live on a reservation and you're Native American, you're still an American citizen. You still have all the protections of the U.S. Constitution, all the protections of laws that we have. But you also have on reservations, there's a sovereignty that's a part of them now through some treaties that we've had after the reservations were created. And that sovereignty allows them to have their own laws on that reservation. And the U.S. government recognizes their law, the law that they have on that reservation. And so if it's different from an American law, as long as that person is tried by their tribal council and they're following the laws of that tribal council of that reservation and they stay on that reservation, those laws apply to them. If they leave that reservation, then they are under the guides of the American system, the American legal system, right? So there's some kind of odd things that happen because of the establishment of the reservations by the U.S. government that are unique and different to the Native American culture than to any other Native or any other group in American culture, in the United States, all right? So the Native Americans are treated differently in the eyes of the law in certain instances than any other, what we would call minority group in America, right? So there's a difference, and it has to do with the reservations, right? But the Indian Wars are now over. Native Americans have been forced onto the reservations. The American military is spread across the Great Plains. Our settlers are there. Our railroads are coming in. We're starting to get to the point that we're going to try to connect our nation, east and west, with our railroads, what we call the Transcontinental Railroad. So there's a huge amount of things that have happened to the United States in a very short period of time. Okay, so we just want to give you just a few images of the West. All right, so this is, of course, a big image of the West where you have your cowboys that are chasing the longhorns for the big roundups to be able to put them on cattle drives and move them northward to the railroads. You had a group called the Pony Express that was part of the Wild West. The Pony Express was mail. They would take mail out to Western settlements and Western towns. They didn't last very long because the railroad was right behind them, and you could load your letters and packages and stuff on trains and send them westward. So the Pony Express is very short-lived, but it's kind of our first attempt at the U.S. mail. All right. So, but it was a private corporation that would do that with the Pony Express. You had the Wild Wild West shows. Remember, we talked about them in helping to save the buffalo. You have people like Wild Bill Cody, Hickok. You have people like Annie Oakley that are part of these shows that travel not just across the United States, but around the world, giving an image of the Wild West. right? They had what are called dime novels, and they would write these novels about people like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and they would write these little dime novels, and people would read and get all excited about the adventure of the Wild Wild West. And these shows, these traveling Wild West shows, went all over the world. And that, from those Wild West shows and from those dime novels and the stories that came out of that, that's the imagery that we get when we think about the Wild West and the settlement of the West. That we get the imagery from these things, from the Wild West shows and the dime novels. And people still today are enamored with the West and the Western frontier. And, that's why the Western genre was so big, especially in the 1950s. Little boys growing up, and little girls too, and growing up in the 1950s, everybody wanted to be a cowboy. They sold the cowboy hats and the guns and the rifles and all of that for kids to play with, because everybody wanted to be able to be a cowboy and to relive the excitement and adventure of the Wild Wild West. And we got that imagery from these shows that we watched, through these big shows that traveled around and reenacted things, in these theaters. They even had the Queen of England. They even did their show in front of the Queen of England. So it was a huge production. They would have covered wagons that would come in. The Indians would attack, and then they would show the U.S. cavalry ride in and save everybody, and just like telling stories, through these adventures, in these Wild West shows. And so that's kind of the imagery that we get from it, right? The image, of course, that you see at the bottom here, these are Native Americans, right? This one is prior to reservation life, right? So you can see the teepees, the fact that this allows them to be nomadic. This is where you live. You can break it down pretty quickly when you need to, and you can travel lightly and still be able to have the home that you need or the house that you need, right? And you can see the meat drying behind them after a buffalo hunt, right? So just huge amount of imagery from this time period, and there's just so much that goes on in this time period. It's a fun time period, but at the same time, it's a dangerous time period. You have good things that happen, and you have really terrible, horrible things that happen during the time period. But this is a mixture. That's what history is. It's a mixture of good and bad. There's good and bad in everything that we're doing. And everything we talk about, you're going to see good and bad. And so, yes, you do see the destruction of the Native American culture, the lifestyle of the Native Americans, and you see the creation of reservation life, which is not a good thing that comes out of it. But when you look at it through the eyes of American history, it's good for the country. The fact that our country moved westward, the fact that our country settled that territory before another country could come in and take it. The fact that we're starting to develop a national economy because we're starting to see development and growth in the West connecting to the cities that we have in the East. We have the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, that's connecting us East and West. So there's all kinds of things that are happening in this westward expansion. You have to look at it as a whole, and you can obviously pick and choose certain sections of it to look at and get more detailed with. You have to look at it as a whole and see, what is America doing? Well, America is growing. We're growing and expanding, and we're becoming one nation. We're still considerably young when you look at world history, and by the time we start to do this, right? But we are a conquering nation. We are a nation that is moving westward into the territory that we've bought with the Louisiana Purchase. We're moving through the Louisiana Purchase territories. We're moving through the Great Plains. We're going all the way to the coast because of our philosophy of manifest destiny. We believe it is our destiny to control coast to coast. Okay? So the next thing that we'll do is we're going to move into industrialization. So after we kind of have the settling of the West, the frontier is over, that frontier life is over, things are settled, The Indian Wars are over. Now we'll move into industrialization as we start to see manufacturing and a different way for our economy to grow through this industrialization process, which will be our next unit. Okay? All right. You guys have a great day. If you have any questions, always feel free to contact me. And we will see you guys later. Have a good one.